Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Oppenheimer live streams. Today, we are going to be going through the 7th day of the security hearing transcript. This is the 3rd episode where we are looking at this 7th day because this is a very long transcript. They were in the security hearing room for a very long time. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be picking up right where we left off at the end of direct examination by Mr. Samuel Silverman of, I believe it was Lilienthal, David Lilienthal. So we're going to be just starting, picking up right where we left off. And as always, if you have any questions for me or any comments, anything you'd like to share, feel free to leave those in the live chat or in the comments of the video after the live stream is over, and I will respond to you either in this stream or by text later to respond to your comments. Also, as I read through this transcript, I'm going to be switching between slides of various historical people, and whoever's face is on screen at the time that I'm talking is going to be the person who is talking from the transcript perspective. So with that all being said, it is again April 20th, 1954, and let's keep going and see what's up next. Okay. So I have no further questions. Mr. Chairman, it is about 4:45. May I ask the pleasure of the board about proceeding? Then there's discussion off the record. I think we will take a recess for a few minutes and then proceed with the examination of the witness. Yes, sir. Then there's a brief recess. Now, the following portion of the proceedings, numbered pages 1321 through 1350 inclusive, is classified and appears in a separate volume. So we're starting off quite excitingly there with a classified volume that has since been declassified, of course. I have no clearance and I'm not exposing any government secrets here. At one time, this part of the transcript was classified, but then later the Department of Energy went back in and declassified this. So here is the classified portion of Lilienthal's testimony. And I just want to check on the audio before I continue. Okay, still looking good. Okay, so yeah, let's get going. Okay, Mr. Rolander is reading. Meeting of the National Security Council, Committee on the Superbomb. Present, Secretary Acheson, Secretary Johnson, Undersecretary Early, Mr. Lilienthal, Dr. Smith, General Burns, Mr. LeBaron, Mr. Fisher, Mr. Arnson, Admiral Sowers, and Mr. Lay. 10:15 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., January 31st, 1950, Room 216, Old State Building. Memorandum dictated by David E. Lilienthal, January 31st, 1950, at 4 p.m. Secretary Acheson opened the meeting. He stated that the committee had had one meeting, that there had been a certain amount of staff work, papers prepared, and discussions by the members of the committee, that it appeared to him that the proper procedure was for the members of the committee to agree upon a recommendation to be followed by a paper written by staff after staff knew what members of the committee were prepared to recommend. Secretary Acheson then said he had before him a paper which he said summarized the background. He said that it was not necessary to read the paper if the members of the committee did not particularly desire this, that it would suffice to read the conclusions reached in the paper. He thereupon read the following, quote, "In the light of the foregoing considerations, the following recommendations are made. A. That the President direct the Atomic Energy Commission to proceed to determine the technical feasibility of a thermonuclear weapon. the scale and rate of effort to be determined jointly by the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense, and that the necessary ordnance developments and carrier program be undertaken concurrently. B, that the President, after decision pending the re-examination referred to in C as to whether thermonuclear weapons should be produced beyond the number required for a test of feasibility. C, that the President direct the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense to undertake a re-examination of our objectives in peace and war and of the effect of these objectives on our strategic plans in the light of the probably fission bomb capability and possible thermonuclear bomb capability of the Soviet Union. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that Oppenheimer's counsel is likely, I don't think they explicitly said it, but they're likely not in the room at this time because confidential material is being read. So Oppenheimer's kind of in there on his own. Anyway, continuing. Okay. D, that the President indicate publicly the intention of this government to continue work to determine the feasibility of a thermonuclear weapon, and that no further official information on it be made public without the approval of the President, end quote. Secretary Acheson then handed out a proposed statement which the President might make in conformity with paragraph D of the recommendations. The proposed statement is as follows, quote, "There has been much public discussion about a project for testing the possibility of a so-called hydrogen or superbomb. The democratic process requires that the people of this country be informed in an orderly manner of decisions which are being made which affect their security. It is part of my responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces to see to it that our country is able to defend itself against any possible aggressor. Accordingly, the Atomic Energy Commission has been directed to continue with the development of all forms of atomic weapons. This work includes a project looking toward a test of the feasibility of the hydrogen bomb. Like all other work in the field of atomic weapons, it is being and will be carried forward on a basis consistent with the overall objectives of our preparedness program. It is important that this project be viewed in its proper perspective. No preparedness program can rely on any single weapon. This is all the more true of a weapon which, given the agreement of others to effective international control, we propose to be banished from national armaments. Furthermore, no preparedness program, no matter how effective, can do more than provide the shield behind which we persevere in our struggle to foster the idea and the reality of individual freedom and human dignity. Our sense of dedication must be directed to the pursuit of an honorable course and to the strengthening of the free world, for there is no short-cut or easy way to security or to international peace and justice." End quote. That's interesting right there because ultimately the President did announce that the country was going to be looking into the development of a superbomb. This would be Truman. And I wonder how much of that statement made it into Truman's actual public address, whether all of it or most of it or just a few parts of it. So that's something I'm going to be looking into in the future, and I'll tell you what I find out because that's an interesting thing there. Anyway, continuing. Secretary Johnson then commented on Secretary Acheson's proposal. He said that the defense establishment was in agreement with the recommendations. They had two suggestions to offer. One was that Recommendation B be eliminated. Recommendation B reads, quote, "that the President defer decision pending the re-examination referred to in C as to whether thermonuclear weapons should be produced beyond the number required for a test of feasibility," end quote. Secretary Johnson also submitted an alternative draft of statement for the President to make. It is much briefer than the one proposed by Secretary Acheson. A copy was not supplied to me, but it was read aloud. Secretary Acheson said we appeared to be in agreement. Should we not see if we could compose the differences between the two proposed public statements? Mr. Early said he recommended that the statement be made by the President in the form of a handout by Charles Ross rather than at a press conference. Secretary Johnson agreed, saying that the thing to do was to play it down, make it just one of those things. Mr. Early further said that the last paragraph of the State Department version seemed better left off. Secretary Johnson thought the first paragraph better be omitted and that we should add something from the statement he recommended about continuing this development until international agreement was reached. I urged that a sentence be added, strengthening the idea that it was not only international agreement that was involved, but a re-examination of our whole position. So I wrote out the following, quote, "We shall also continue to examine all those factors that affect our program for peace and this country's security," end quote. The words I prepared were accepted. I also suggested that the statement say that the President's direction related to continuing work, rather than give the impression of suddenly beginning something wholly new. I proposed amending the sentence as it originally read in the State Department draft from, quote, "Accordingly, the Atomic Energy Commission has been directed to continue with the development of all forms of atomic weapons. This work includes a project looking toward a test of the feasibility of the hydrogen bomb," end quote. 2. Accordingly, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, end quote. This was accepted. In its approved form, the recommended statement by the President read as follows, quote, "It is part of my responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces to see to it that our country is able to defend itself against any possible aggressor. Accordingly, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen bomb or superbomb. Like all other work in the field of atomic weapons, it is being and will be carried forward on a basis consistent with the overall objectives of our program for peace and security. This we shall continue to do until a satisfactory plan for international control of atomic energy is achieved. We shall also continue to examine all those factors that affect our program for peace and this country's security," end quote. At this point, I asked an opportunity to express my views, which was afforded me. I began by stating that I was under no illusion about the limited value or effect of advice to the President from me, when it conflicted with a recommendation agreed to by both the Secretaries of State and Defense. Nevertheless, my reservations about the course recommended in some important respects were so great that I felt it necessary to refer to them very briefly. Following is my recollection of my remarks. For 3 years, since the beginning of the Commission, I had made efforts to have the Commission function in the spirit and the letter of a law, providing for civilian control of atomic weapon development. The statute provides that the President annually should determine the rate and number and kinds of weapons produced. Annually, the Commission and the Secretary of Defense transmitted jointly to the President a memorandum on this subject, which the President approved, and which thereupon became the Commission's directive. At no time was the Commission supplied with any of the information or views of the military establishment, upon which the military recommendations had been based. Therefore, the Commission at no time examined into the underlying assumptions and the policies and plans of the military establishment in respect to the necessity for or the adequacy of the number of weapons provided for and the rate of their production. I did not think this represented a serious issue, except in the abstract, up to the time of the expansion program proposal of last spring. The reasons this is so is that saying that we needed everything that could come out of the spigot was so obviously right that no examination of assumptions was required. When the expansion program came along last spring and summer, a different situation appeared. The President himself directed that the assumptions underlying this proposal be examined into by a special committee of the National Security Council, consisting of the same members as of this committee. See letter to Admiral Sowers from the President, dated July 26, 1949. But this move to examine into the military assumptions and policies did not succeed. I said the reasons why it didn't succeed were not particularly relevant at this juncture. The proposal for accelerated research and development toward a thermonuclear weapon, however, presented a clear case where the underlying assumptions, policies, and plans of the military establishment to provide for our defense needed to be examined independently if there was to be substance to the principle of civilian control of atomic weapons by the Commission. If a military conclusion could not be examined into, and was not examined into independently by the Secretary of State, the Atomic Energy Commission, and of course by the President, but was regarded as the whole answer to the ultimate question, then this definitely removes any notion of civilian participation in a fundamental policy question. A beginning of an examination of military assumptions, policies, and plans for the security of the country by members of this committee and by staff has been made in the past weeks. I stated as my opinion that this represented substantial progress. I stated that the recognition that the Secretary of State as well as the Secretary of Defense had a right and a duty to examine into these assumptions and see if they furthered our overall national purposes was an important outcome of this whole consideration of the superbomb. Accordingly, I thought Recommendation C was an important element in this whole matter, namely a real inquiry into the basic question, what is the best way to further the common defense and security, to which questions as to our atomic bomb programs and the plans for their use and the thermonuclear development are subsequent. I said moral questions, questions of the utter frightfulness of this weapon, questions of again seeking international control, all are relevant, but none seem to me the essential questions. A principal misgiving and grave reservation about the wisdom of the recommendation to proceed forthwith and without more with the thermonuclear research at an accelerated pace and proceed prior to this all-important re-examination of our present course was as follows, that I felt that such a direction by the President prior to that re-examination and perhaps resetting of the course would be highly prejudicial to the examination itself. I recognized that the atmosphere of excitement resulting from a further delay of a decision of the President would not be the best atmosphere in which to function. I was, however, impressed in my own mind with the counter-consideration, that the atmosphere resulting from the conditions under which to conduct the examination and would probably make a new approach to the atomic weapons race impossible. The injury to vital concerns affecting our security and our position in the world, and to the likelihood of a searching, objective re-examination, outweighed in my mind the troubles inherent in the course of taking a new look first. The central question seems to me not whether we should build the superbomb or not build it. Rather, we should first face up to weaknesses in our present national position and not threaten by a decision now what might be the last chance to adopt a less certain course of danger. The decision to proceed before exploring those weaknesses and see what we could do about them might well mean we would not later be able to face up to them, or we just would not face up to them, or facing up to them would come too late. I admitted that the weaknesses I saw in our present course might not be confirmed by such a hard new look, or might be even worse than I feared. But unless we faced up to them as a principal problem, they would plague our future Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense, Chiefs of Staff, and Presidents and bear them down with perhaps overwhelming problems, whereas if perhaps faced up to now, they were not unmanageable. The decision recommended here is to proceed now to, quote, augment to the greatest extent possible the effort devoted to superbomb research, end quote, and to proceed with a test in 1952 as a target, that is, a test, quote, at the fastest practicable rate, end quote. The disadvantages of this course that I see are of several characters. First, the act of directing that this proceed cannot be minimized by mere statements such as we recommended to the President. It is too great an act for that. It is more eloquent and meaningful than any words that accompany it, or any speech saying it means this or that. The act, I feared, would be widely regarded as a confirmation in the clearest possible terms of our present chief and almost sole reliance upon this kind of armament against the Russians. It seemed to me that the present course of having, as General Bradley indicated, virtually nothing else but the atomic bomb that we could use for the defense of Europe today, or in the near future, is clearly a weakness. we would hide from ourselves the existence of that weakness by magnifying and redoubling and multiplying our efforts along the same course, a course that seems to me highly doubtful of value today. I stated that, in my opinion, we are today relying on an asset that is steadily depreciating for us, i.e., weapons of mass destruction. The president's decision would tend to confuse and unwittingly hide the fact and make it more difficult to find some other course. The act of going ahead would tend to provide a false and dangerous assurance to the American people that when we get this new gadget, quote, the balance will be ours, as against the Russians. As evidence in support of this, I cited two kinds of witnesses. One, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in their paper dated January 13, 1950, Memorandum for the Secretary of Defense, subject, Request for a Committee on Military Views of Members of General Advisory Committee. See pages 9 and 10 for example as follows, quote, 4. Question. Would known possession of the superbomb grossly alter the psychological balance between the United States and the USSR? Comment. They believe it would, and further that the balance would be grossly in favor of the United States until such time as the USSR had developed a stockpile of superbombs. 5. Question. What effect did announcement of the Russian explosion have upon the feeling of security of the American public? Comment. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are informed that this is a question now under highest priority study by the Central Intelligence Agency. So far as the responsibilities of the Department of Defense are concerned, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are of the opinion that the American public now feels less secure than prior to their knowledge of Russian possession of atomic capability, and that the public expects the Department of Defense to take action necessary to regain the favorable balance previously held." End quote. I do not believe it is clear at all that the assumptions here implied are justified. I referred also to comments of leading members of the Congress during the past week or so. These comments include those of the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Senate and of the Minority Leader, Senator Weary. They show that assumptions will be drawn from proceeding with this development, which I do not believe are justified, and I fear will make more difficult a facing up to the wasting and dwindling value to this country of weapons of mass destruction as the principal basis of the defense of this country and of Europe. I said I was concerned that the act of going ahead, far from strengthening our defense or atomic program, would magnify its weaker aspects. These aspects include such matters as 1. The value of A-bombs since September 23rd to deter or to prevent Russia overrunning our European allies. 2. The impact of the decision to proceed on the feeling of the inevitability of war and therefore weakening the basis of our present course, which is there will be no war soon. At this point, I interpolated that the present assumption of this government is clearly that there will be no war with the Russians in the immediate future, that is to say, in the matter of 2 or 3 years. If this is not a sound assumption, if the assumption is that war is likely in the next 2 or 3 years, then the question of proceeding with the H-bomb is an easy one. But more important than that, we should be getting ready for war, whereas at the present time we are not getting ready for war. I said we ought, on that assumption, to send my son back into the service. We should be really taxing ourselves. We should stop the making our pleasure automobiles, etc. But this is not the assumption. The assumption is that we are not going to have a war with the Russians in the next few years. Therefore, why can we not spend a few months for an intensive and realistic re-examination of the worsening of our position as the result of our preoccupation with atomic weapons? It seemed to me that this was a far wiser course than to make a decision, prejudicing the re-examination, and I feared making it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to face the realities, or to take another course that might save the world from the fury of the atomic arms race and the tension between the USA and USSR. It seems to me that unless the assumption is an early war, we have the time to realign our policies and ought to do nothing to make that realignment more difficult or perhaps, as I believe, well nigh impossible. I said there were other weaknesses in our present course, which I feared the decision at this time might make harder to correct. Thus, we take a position as a nation that atomic weapons should and must be eliminated, but our military leaders are depending almost entirely upon atomic weapons in the event of war. This kind of contradictory position is not merely a defect of reasoning, a faulty argument. It is a positive danger to continue both these courses at the same time. To go ahead on a new cycle of atomic weapons, the super, might well make it more difficult for that defect to be faced and something done about it. The net of my reservation about this recommendation, therefore, was this: the decision to proceed forthwith, with nothing more, maybe, and I fear will be to miss an opportunity to re-examine and realign our policy, a better opportunity than may ever appear again to better our security and promote something better than a headlong rush to a war of mass destruction weapons. Following my statement, Secretary Acheson said that he found little in what I said with which he would disagree. He said further, however, that it still did not offer an alternative that appealed to him, that he felt that the pressure for a decision was so great that the discussions and feeling in Congress had reached such a point that to defer the decision to this purpose was an alternative that he could not recommend. Secretary Johnson apparently agreed. "We must protect the president," he said. We then proceeded to a discussion of the recommendations themselves. Dr. Smith suggested to me that paragraph B, which the Secretary of Defense urged be left out, should be retained. His point was that B left intended to justify and strengthen the idea of a re-examination. Secretary Johnson said that he felt B was not needed and that he had other objections, which he did not explain, to it. It was stricken out. Paragraph C, directing the re-examination of objectives, was then discussed. It was pointed out that in the paper presented by Secretary Acheson, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, my successor, was omitted from the group. The reasons for this, the Secretary of State stated, were several. He said there was, first of all, the obvious difficulty of working with a 5-man commission in a matter of this kind. The second point was that to have the commission on the same level as the head of a department might seem inappropriate. Third, that the commission's function was actually related to the technical aspects rather than the issues that were the subject matter of this direction. Admiral Sowers pointed out that this re-examination would involve discussion of strategic war plans and the whole field of our world relations. Secretary Acheson added that our relations with the Russians were now in a worsening condition. The inference I drew from this discussion was that this participation in basic policy re-examination was regarded as rather remote from the functions of the Commission as conceived by the other members of the committee. Secretary Acheson asked my opinion about the omission of the Commission. I said that I would defer to Dr. Smith's opinion on this since I was practically out of office, and it was a matter of direct concern for my colleagues and my successor. With this qualification, I stated that I was in agreement with the 5-man commission, point. With this qualification, I stated that I was in agreement with the 5-man commission point was a good one. That the problems of the chairman of the commission or the representative of the commission serving as a co-equal with individuals who are the heads of their departments and could speak for them was a real and substantial difficulty. Secretary Acheson said there was the further difficulty that under the law and the commission's practice, the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy was kept informed by the commission on almost a day-to-day basis, that the inclusion in the commission of this study would doubtless require that the current investigation into this matter be supplied to the Joint Committee, while the discussions were tentative and even though they included matters of the utmost secrecy. This was a major objection. I said that I could not agree that this was a real point, that he thought the 5-man point could be worked out, but that the Joint Committee problem was a real one in this kind of situation. Admiral Sowers concurred about this Joint Committee phase of the matter. Secretary Acheson said further, however, that it would be his purpose and intention to consult on technical matters with a technically qualified member of the commission, presumably Dr. Smith. Furthermore, he said that specifically the General Advisory Committee to the Commission or members of that committee would certainly be consulted, particularly since they had taken a strong and critical view about our present policies in this whole matter. Secretary Johnson then recommended that we go to the White House at once and get a decision. He said he already had an appointment at 12:30, and we could use that. He said the heat was on in Congress, and every hour counted in getting this matter disposed of. Okay, so that was just Rolander reading this memo. But now we're going to get into some cross-examination. May I ask you, sir, do you take shorthand? Yes. So I assume you made shorthand notes on this meeting. I do take shorthand, and I did take notes. The recommendations A, B, C, and D, had you seen or been told about those before they were read by Mr. Acheson? No. The general tenor of the discussions didn't make this a surprise, but I had not seen the recommendations. Had you consulted with them about what they might be? With Secretaries Johnson and Acheson? Yes. My recollection is rather unclear on this. We only had one meeting with the two secretaries, as I recall. That was in that same week. I'm not very clear on that. Were those recommendations in accord with your views? No, they came closer to my views in the light of these reservations I had expressed than the final recommendation, because they did imply that there would be a re-examination of our whole situation in connection with this undertaking. The reason this recommendation comes closer than would appear on the surface is that this recommendation seemed to me to be not the accelerated all-out crash program that had been considered, but something less than that, an accelerated research and development program with a test rather than a crash production program. That seemed to me to have some merit. These recommendations I was prepared to go along with for whatever importance it had, which was not very much. If there could be a really strong statement about a re-examination of our weakened general military and diplomatic position. You were in accord with recommendation B, were you not, that the President defer decision pending the re-examination referred to in C as to whether thermonuclear weapons should be produced beyond the number required for a test of feasibility? No, I think not. My preference would certainly have been that the President would have instituted a re-examination without doing more than having the Commission continue its research and development program. That recommendation B is considerably short of that. Considerably short looked at one way. Another way, it goes considerably beyond what you thought you ought to do, doesn't it? Yes. In other words, you thought you ought merely to re-examine the situation without going ahead with the program. Is that right? That is, the thermonuclear program? I thought a continuation of the program that I have described here, including the so-called booster, which is a classified code name, this is the 25 times the Hiroshima bomb, plus and continuing the pace on the research and development work, while a real look at what Korea made us look at, whether we like it or not, would have been the best program at the time for the reasons stated. I did not underestimate the difficulties of following up a program in view of the great commitment of the H-bomb at that time. I thought it was important that someone state what the other side. In other words, what you were for was continuing research, but not going ahead with a thermonuclear program beyond that. Is that right? I think the word crash program comes as close in shorthand of what I thought we should not institute. That, in fact, is what was instituted. A research program carrying the super development along would not require any public announcement, which it was quite evident the crash program would. Were you in favor of going ahead with the program to the point of testing a thermonuclear weapon? I don't know that alternative was ever open. Did the program which you envisioned and which you favored include a test of thermonuclear weapon? The view I expressed here was that before that kind of decision is made, that we take a look at the effectiveness of our whole military and diplomatic situation and repair that as part of a further weapon program. If that further weapon program required an H-bomb, that would be another matter. But we could not decide it under the circumstances of having made a profound public decision to go ahead on a crash program of the H-bomb. I'm afraid that events rather confirmed that. A re-examination, although there are some indications in this statement, will be made. A re-examination was not made. So you were not in favor prior to what you describe as a re-examination of embarking on a program which would lead to a test of the thermonuclear weapon, were you? I was not at this time in favor of a crash program, that is right. No, sir, that is not my question, Mr. Lilienthal. Is my question not clear to you, sir? Obviously, a test would be required in a crash program. I think this makes rather clear that I thought it was unwise to embark on so accelerated a program, including a test, until we had seen whether the program we then had and our general starving of the rest of our military establishment was not a dangerous thing and should not be corrected. I think that is as near as I can come to answering it. Were you in favor of any program, whether you call it a crash program or what, which would include a test of a thermonuclear weapon? Not at that time. That is what I wanted to get. This is a preliminary to any such program. May I interrupt a minute? Then there's discussion off the record. Mr. Lilienthal, I notice on page 3 of your memorandum, you refer to the discussion of the language of the President's announcement. You say, quote, I proposed amending the statement. You say, quote, I proposed amending the sentence as it originally read in the State Department draft from, quote, accordingly, the Atomic Energy Commission has been directed to continue with the development of all forms of atomic weapons. This work includes a project looking toward a test of the feasibility of the hydrogen bomb, end quote. You favored changing it to, quote, accordingly, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, end quote. You eliminated the reference to a test, didn't you? No, I was assuming... Did you say no? Let me explain. I was assuming that the recommendation of the President would be as joined in by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. I was trying to strengthen that statement by a portion of my views which are included in this statement. But I did make clear to the other members of the committee that I thought before we did anything, this stern re-examination of our picture should be taken. Yes, but the language which you wanted included in the statement eliminated any reference to a test, didn't it? Yes, I thought I made that clear. Now you refer to, quote, to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, end quote. Just what were you doing on the hydrogen bomb? There has been, over a period of years, work in the theoretical division of the Atomic Energy Commission, or the Los Alamos Laboratory, and this was directed toward the rather considerable problems of making a bomb which would be based on the ignition of hydrogen, tritium, and so on, a bomb described in a public document and usually referred to as the hydrogen bomb. That work was going on. The details of it I am not familiar with, but it was certainly being carried on from the first contact I had with the Commission. That is what I am asking you about, Mr. Lilienthal. What were the details of the work which you referred to in that statement, quote, to continue its work on the hydrogen bomb, end quote? Just what was being done? I have to refer to the records on that, but there was a program of investigation of thermonuclear reactions. Yes, you said that before, but what I'm getting at is precisely what were you doing? How many people had you working on it? I don't know. How much time had they spent? I can't answer that and couldn't precisely at that time. The records are available. It was part of the work program of the Los Alamos Laboratory, and it was reported from time to time. If I told you, Mr. Lilienthal, that the records showed that there was comparatively little work that had been done or was being done, would you dispute that? No, comparatively little compared to the other programs that were approved. I'm sure that is true. I will reframe the question. If I told you that the records show that there was little work that had been done, would you dispute that? Yes, I think I would. It covers a long period of time. Now, referring to page 4 of your memorandum, you say, quote, "At no time was the Commission supplied with any of the information or views of the military establishment upon which the military recommendations had been based. Therefore, the Commission at no time examined into the underlying assumptions and the policies and plans of the military establishment in respect to the necessity for or the adequacy of the number of weapons provided for and the rate of their production," end quote. By that, did you mean that you didn't have much information about what the military was doing or what they wanted? No, the reason for their wanting it. They said, quote, "We want X amount of material in this next year," end quote. The chairman of the commission, on behalf of the commission, underwrote this as a conclusion, as if we had an opportunity to examine the reasons for that conclusion of the defense establishment. We didn't have that information. What we did was to sign jointly with the Secretary of Defense a statement of what the program the President should follow. Were you privy to the plans and needs of the military? No, we were told what their requirements were, but we were not supplied the information as to the basis of that. On page 5 of the memorandum, you say, quote, "I said moral questions of the utter frightfulness of this weapon, questions of, again, seeking international control, all are relevant, but none seem to me the central questions," end quote. What did you mean by moral questions? The questions of the effect in a Cold War sense or a psychological war sense of engaging in a program of bombs of unlimited size on the views of the United States taken by friendly or by now friendly countries. The moral position of the country, I suppose, is a short way of putting it. This was relevant, but I didn't think it was central. You did, in this memorandum, Mr. Lilienthal, take issue with the military judgment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, didn't you? I certainly did. Did you consider yourself to be qualified to do that? No, I considered I had to express my independent view that we were in a weakened condition based on General Bradley's statement. May I quote the essence of what he said to us, which he said publicly on November 1950. This is by no means critical of General Bradley. I'm just indicating the shock it gave me. He said, quote, "It is a bruising and shocking fact that when we Americans were committed in Korea, we were left without military strength with which to face any enemy at any other specific point. Certainly, we were left without the strength to meet a general attack. In the military sense, the free world was left without adequate reserves except for the atom bomb," end quote. When General Bradley said that to us upon questioning, it seemed to me important as a public servant and a layman to express great consternation and concern that this country was in that condition and that something effective should be done about it, even though that involved changing the economy program and redrafting of men. This was in, as you recall, or these meetings were, in the end of January 1950. The 25th of June, the Korean War broke out, and we then found the condition we were in. I don't have any notion that I have military judgment, but I have a feeling that when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff makes a statement of that kind in a proceeding in which I have been asked by the President to express my honest opinion, I have to express the opinion of great concern. Did he make that statement publicly in Chicago? He did make that in November 1950 to the Executives Club. Was there any question at the time you had this meeting that the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to go ahead with the H-bomb program? Yes, at the time of this meeting late in January, the defense establishment, speaking through Secretary Johnson, and presumably representing the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did want to go ahead with the crash program on the H-bomb. It was my unpleasant duty, since the President asked me to express my honest opinion. I said I thought until we got our whole situation in order, this was an unwise course. May I ask you, sir, do you have any further comment on this memorandum before we go into so-called open session? Just one, and it may be off the record. As I hear this read over the gap of 4 years, it sounds very pretentious. But this is the situation when one is asked to explain his opinion as a layman by the President of the United States. He has to express the views he has. It does sound as if I was setting my judgment up against the judgment of other people. I have no apologies to offer for that, except that was the pickle the President put in putting me on this committee. I must say, if the question is, was the decision at the time wise or not, I don't know. I'm not a sufficient dogmatist to say that the decision that was taken was wrong. I'm not a sufficient dogmatist to say today that my viewpoint was right. But this is the way it looked to me then. I have just one question, which perhaps can be asked when counsel for Dr. Oppenheimer returns, but it is suggested by something in this memorandum. I guess this is in the President's statement. This section C, or the proposed statement. This is on the first page. That is, the President direct certain things to be done, quote, in the light of the probable fission bomb capability and possible thermonuclear bomb capability of the Soviet Union, end quote. Perhaps I can just expose this and then we can discuss that later on. I will want to ask a question later on about your views as to the possible thermonuclear bomb capabilities of the Soviet Union. I suppose we can do that without reference to this memorandum. In other words, you have discussed this aside from anything that took place in this meeting, is that correct? Yes. Since my counsel is absent, may I ask one question of the witness? Yes. Do you recall General Bradley's comments at the joint meeting of the General Advisory Committee on October 29th? I have a recollection of a comment he made. Well, counsel is back. It is relevant to what we have been talking about. You may answer that. When counsel come back, you can ask them that question. It was in the substance of his comment, and I am not sure that can't be answered. Then there's some discussion off the record, and the classified section is over. So now we're going back to unclassified things. But yeah, that was interesting. Just a bit of a memorandum of Lilienthal expressing his opinions on the, atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb situation at the time in 1950. All right. Mr. Lilienthal, Dr. Oppenheimer, just before his counsel came back in, suggested a question to be asked of you, and I believe it was, do you recall a discussion or a statement by General Bradley before the General Advisory Committee at the October 29, 1949 meeting? Is that right? Right. The only comment that I recall was in response to a question about the military value of a bomb of virtually 1,000 times Hiroshima, and his response was, as I recall, that it would be principally psychological. I don't recall how he defined that. That is the only recollection that comes to my mind of that discussion. May I ask one more question? Do you recollect his account of our military position as of October 29, 1949? No, I recollect that description in a later phase of my activities in the National Security Council subcommittee, but not at the meeting of October 29. Mr. Lilienthal, Were the views expressed by you in this memorandum of January 31st, 1950, so far as you knew, in accord with the views of Dr. Oppenheimer at that time? No, I don't know to what extent they were in accord. Consultations I had with Dr. Oppenheimer in the GAC were more or less terminated after the report. But there are things in this position that do relate to the views of the GAC, such as the over-reliance on large bombs. Did you discuss your appearance at this meeting with Dr. Oppenheimer before you went there? No, I don't recall I did at all. Did you report to him afterwards about it? I will give you the rest of the events in answer to that. After this meeting referred to, we did go to the president. The president made his decision. I then went back to the Atomic Energy Building where the GAC was in session and reported the decision. That is the last I have had to do with the subject. Did you talk to Dr. Oppenheimer personally about this conference that you had? I don't believe so. I think the GAC, or most of the members, were in session. It could be that I did. I do have the recollection of reporting to the group as a whole. Whether I saw him separately, I'm not clear. Do you have any reason to believe that the views expressed by you in this memorandum differ from the views held by Dr. Oppenheimer at that time? I haven't any way of really knowing. I can identify some of the views that grew out of GAC recommendations in which Dr. Oppenheimer either led or took part, but taking it as a whole, I have no way of identifying it in that way. Did you believe on January 31st, 1950, when you addressed your remarks to this meeting, that the views you were expressing were in accord with the views previously expressed by the GAC in their report? It seems to me that the GAC, except as to its conclusion and the views I expressed in this memorandum and to the National Security Council subcommittee, do not coincide. They are not in conflict in some places, but they certainly cannot be said to be identical. An examination of the GAC's report, I think, will make that clear. Wherein do they differ? I can't answer that without having the report before me, which you can do as well as I. There are many points in here. For example, the powerless state of our defense at this time was not included in the GAC report to the best of my recollection. I will reframe my question then. Did you believe at the time you addressed these remarks to this meeting that the views you expressed with respect to the thermonuclear program were in accord with the views of the GAC? You see, I didn't think the issue was the thermonuclear program. I'm asking you now. I don't quite see how one can answer the question put that way. I didn't think that was the issue. I hope I have made it plain in this memorandum. I didn't think that was the central issue. I thought the central issue was getting busy strengthening the security of this country, which was in bad shape. You mean you were not talking about the thermonuclear program at this meeting? Of course I was, but I didn't think that was the central question. Whether it was the central question or not, you talked about it, didn't you? Yes, of course. Do you have any doubt that what you had to say about the thermonuclear program was in accord with the views of the GAC? It certainly was in accord with the views as to the result that a crash should not be instituted, but the reasons for that and the conditions that I had suggested grew out of my discussions with the military establishment and with Dr. Smith. I understand that. The GAC made a report to your commission setting forth their views about what should be done with respect to the thermonuclear, didn't they? Yes. And you talked about that when you appeared at this meeting on January 31st, 1950, didn't you? Yes. Now, was what you said at the meeting in any respect different from what you understood to be the views of the GAC on the thermonuclear program? I have tried to answer that by saying that as to the result, the difficulties. It is the reasoning that I adduced was not the reasoning in substantial part, the reasons that are stated in the GAC's report, and that is evident by reading it. Were your conclusions the same? The net result was very close to being the same, namely that we should not proceed. But the alternative that I proposed was not the alternative that the GAC proposed. I mean, that is a very important distinction. I want to be sure it is said that I benefited a good deal, in my view, from the discussions and the GAC report, but the net result is quite a different argument. You have told us you were not in favor of a test program. That is right, until we got ourselves in shape. Was the GAC? No. So you were in accord on that. That is right. The thing GAC didn't say, at least as I recall, its support was to make this point that before we decide this question and commit ourselves further to over-reliance on weapons of this kind, we should make a stern re-examination of our position. That they did not say. That is what I have been trying to say. I think that is an important qualification. Wasn't the GAC pretty unqualifiedly against developing a thermonuclear at that time? The best record of that is what they said, and I think the answer to that is that 6 of them were flatly against it. Did you take any advice or get any information from the experts at the GAC as to the feasibility of the thermonuclear? Yes, they did supply us with their conclusion about whether it was feasible or not. What was it? That conclusion is written in this report to the President of November 9. I would not undertake, it is before you. As I recall, it says that the chances of its being feasible are 50-50 or something like that. Maybe a little better than that, doesn't it say that? I have forgotten, but it is there in the report. Did you get any opinion as to the possible thermonuclear bomb capability of the Russians? I didn't understand you. Did I get from where? Did you get any opinion from the GAC or anybody else as to the possible thermonuclear bomb capability of the Soviet Union? I don't recall, except that the assumption was, without any discussion, that the Russians were capable. It was only safe to assume that the Russians were capable of producing a hydrogen bomb. It was just a question of time, isn't that right? Yes, something of that sort. The only safe assumption was to believe that in time they could do it. From whom did you get that information? It was not a matter of information. It was an assumption that was adopted. Didn't you check with the scientists? You did not know yourself, did you? No, there were no intelligence reports that I can recall. Did you talk to any of the experts on the GAC about whether or not the Russians might produce a thermonuclear? I don't recall anything, except that we started from that premise that in time they could do it. Who is we? Everyone who was discussing the matter, GAC, the AEC, and so on. I think that is what we advised the President. We were all agreed that was probably the case. In other words, that was the opinion of the GAC, was it not? Yes, that is right. Opinion is not quite the word because we didn't have any facts. We just said we have to assume that they are capable of doing it. You are not an expert on such matters. No, I think the term possible capabilities was one way of expressing it. I think we went farther than that and thought it was better to assume that it was not only possible, but that they could do it. Mr. Lilienthal, the question of whether or not the Russians could make a thermonuclear is a pretty important factor. Yes, you are using thermonuclear, and we were talking about a hydrogen bomb. You used the expression thermonuclear in your memorandum of January 31st, 1950. Yes, but I think the GAC referred to it as the super, which was the hydrogen bomb. The question of whether or not the Russians could make the super was a pretty important factor. It was. So I assume you get the best opinion you could. It was not a question of fact. It was a question of opinion. That's right. Whose opinion did you take? I don't recall, but I assume it would be scientists or intelligence officers. Probably the scientists, probably the GAC. Probably Dr. Oppenheimer. I rather you would not push me after I said I don't remember. I'm sorry I have to push you because I want to get responsive answers. I don't remember, but I am saying that this was the assumption on which we proceeded. It would be reasonable that you did consult the men who knew most about such matters, wouldn't it? You can say that. I have not said it. Wouldn't it? Aren't we in argument now? I think the record is clear. Look, we told the president that is the basis on which we were proceeding. What I'm trying to find out is where you got your information. I assume you did not get it from me or Mr. Garrison. He said he had no information. I'm trying to find out why you made the assumption. I agreed with you that probably the opinion came from the GAC, but we didn't have any information. Mr. Lilienthal, just so the record will be clear, this memorandum of January 31st, 1950, you wrote and put in the AEC files, is that right? That is right. And at that time, it was classified as top secret. I classified it, yes. And then there came a time on April 1st, 1953, apparently, when that was classified to confidential security information. Yes. Did there come a time when you were given the original of that memorandum of the AEC files? Yes, I called on the chairman of the commission, Gordon Dean, and consulted with him about this. He asked the classification division and the secretary of the commission to look into the matter, and some weeks later it was sent to me by the secretary of the commission with a letter and a note from Mr. Beckerly, the head of the classification division. Do you want to read that in the record? It is up to you if you want to read it. Does it advance our inquiry? I don't think so. The only thing that bothers me is whether we have to ask counsel to leave. In any case, it expresses Mr. Beckerly's view about the reclassification. When did you receive this from the commission? I don't have Mr. Snap's letter. Would it appear on Mr. Beckerly's note? No, this seems to be undated. About when? I'm sorry, it is dated. October 6th, 1953 is his note, and it was probably mailed to me sometime after that. That would be last November. Why did you want to get this from the commission? It was a statement of my views, and I was quite anxious for my own protection to have access to a statement that I had written about my own views. It seemed to me very important, and it is even more important now. Protection from what? Protection of my record as to what my views were at that time. The reason being that my views have been extemporized on in the press and elsewhere, and I felt much easier having a record of just exactly what it was I said. I assume you have kept this confidential. Yes, and I have kept it in a safe and so on. I plan to return it to the commission now that I know you have a photostat. Beg pardon? I think now that it is in the record and you have a photostat of it, it is probably just as well for me to return it to the commission or put it in a lockbox. I see. I see. You thought when you got it back that this was the only copy. No, I knew it had been photostated. Excuse me, I feel it my duty to point out to the witness that he has made conflicting statements on the question of photostating. I don't care what your answer is, but earlier you said you had not known it was photostated. This is in your interest. Yes, the facts are these, that this was put in a sealed envelope and filed. Then I inquired of the secretary of the commission what about that sealed envelope, and he told me that it later had been opened and had been put into the files of the commission and had been photostated. I may have misunderstood you, I'm sorry, but I believe the earlier transcript, perhaps when we were in executive session, will reflect an observation, maybe casual, that you had not known it had been photostated. I thank the chairman. These are the facts. Again, in the interest of clarifying the record, didn't you just say that now that you have learned that the Commission had photostated this document, you might as well return the original? Mr. Chairman, does this have relevance to the inquiry relating to Dr. Oppenheimer? The chairman will make this observation. He is trying to do his best to conduct a fair hearing. The chairman will make this observation. He is trying to do his best to conduct a fair hearing, and when it appears to the chairman that a witness through inadvertence or somewhere else is in a position of perjuring himself, I am going to call it to his attention. You are right, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to use the word perjury, but if at one point of the testimony a witness says one thing and at another point he says directly contrary, at one point the testimony is in error. I don't think it advances anything, the protection of Mr. Lilienthal's appearance as a witness in this case. I was not referring to your inquiry. I was referring to Mr. Robb's question. Mr. Robb's question which was not related to that. Will you read the question back, Mr. Reporter? Question read by the reporter. Yes. Just a minute. Did the chairman hear the question? The chair is a little confused. Does the witness object to answering this question? Whatever is the easiest and the quickest way to do it. Let us clear the record. I had been told in a conversation with the Secretary of the Commission that he opens the envelope and put this in the file and had photostated it. It was only yesterday that I saw that this was true, that I saw the photostat in the file that was supplied to me, yesterday afternoon in Mr. Snap's office. I was then reassured that there was a photostat. I didn't want to leave it simply on Mr. Snap's general assertion. I now know that there is such a photostat because I have seen it. May I repeat the question, in the interest of clarifying the record? Didn't you say a little while ago that now that you know that there has been a photostat made, you may as well return the original? That is right. I now know because I have seen the photostat. You mean you learned for the first time yesterday that there had been a photostat made? For the first time I saw it, and was sure the information supplied me was correct. Now, may I say, sir, go back to the beginning of your testimony in which you gave an account of the events which took place in March 1947. I believe you said that the file was delivered to you on a Saturday, March 8th. Is that right? That is my recollection, yes. By messenger? I don't recall. It was delivered to the Commission. No, I do recall now. My recollection is that I had a call from Tom Jones. Who was he, for the record? Tom Jones, who was the acting security officer at that time. My recollection is that he phoned me. I think this was a Saturday afternoon. The file Mr. Hoover referred to in his telephone conversation to me had been received. And then it was delivered to you. It was delivered to me Monday morning. Monday morning. That is my recollection, Monday the 10th. It was delivered to the Commission, that is, to Mr. Jones or someone on the 8th. And there was with that, I assume, a covering letter from Mr. Hoover, is that correct? I assume so. What you have referred to here as the file was the material you got from Mr. Hoover, is that right? Yes, that is right. On either March the 8th or March 10th, whichever day you received it. Yes. That is what you refer to as the file. That is correct. What did that consist of? I can't recall, except that was a very substantial file, that it contained the kind of a great deal of material from the Manhattan District Intelligence Division, or whatever it was called, counterintelligence. It was a typical FBI file, a typical FBI personnel file. I have before me what you received, Mr. Lilienthal. It appears to be a 12-page summary memorandum on J. Robert Oppenheimer and a 15-page summary memorandum on Frank Oppenheimer. Is that in accord with your recollection of what you received? No, it's not. I'm sure you are obviously correct. My recollection was that we had a big file. I didn't recall that there was a summary from the FBI. Is it is it now your testimony that you had received something in addition to this summary memorandum from the FBI? My recollection is that we did get, this is quite a while ago, and I don't recall the exact form in which it came. Would you describe these two reports as a file? You mean as distinguished from a report? Yes, sir. In view of what you have told me, a file or report, I should think, would be equally descriptive. What you are suggesting is that this was a summary of the content of the file rather than the raw material of the file, and that apparently is what is the case if that is what you say. The letter from Mr. Hoover, Mr. Lilienthal, see if this refreshes your recollection, dated March 8th, 1947, addressed to you, quote, "My dear Mr. Lilienthal, in view of developments to date, I thought it best to call to your attention the attached copies of summaries of information contained in our files relative to Julius Robert Oppenheimer, who has been appointed as a member of the General Advisory Committee, and his brother, Frank Friedman Oppenheimer, who was employed in the radiation laboratory at Berkeley, California until recently. It will be observed that much of the material here contained in the attached memoranda was obtained from confidential sources," end quote. Having heard that, do you agree that what you got was the two summaries? Is that the whole letter? I don't know the distinction between the summary and the report, but whatever you have there, if you have it, I received. In order to refresh my recollection of this hearing, I asked for this file yesterday and was told it was an FBI file and I could not see it. If I had seen it, my recollection would have been refreshed. You know, don't you, Mr. Lilienthal, that the rules for security hearings, which I believe were adopted while you were chairman, provide that the contents of FBI files may not be disclosed? Yes, but the rules of the commission, as I understand, permit commissioners to have access to anything they had access to during the period of their commissionership. I don't want to debate that with you. I apparently am wrong if that is the regulation now, but that is what I asked for. Mr. Chairman, since this is now the subject of discussion of the record, I would like to request that we be furnished a copy of this summary. No, sir, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I would have to object to that. I think we are in agreement with what was furnished, Mr. Lilienthal. You have it there. Mr. Lilienthal has not received it, and you have told him he received it, but he doesn't know what it is. I can't make a ruling about the availability of FBI documents. I can't rule affirmatively in response to your request. As of this minute, I will have to be guided by the security officer and the attorneys in this, Mr. Garrison. Mr. Chairman, the rules under which these hearings are conducted provide that reports of the Federal Bureau of Investigation shall not be disclosed to the individual or to his representatives. Mr. Chairman, we have a new reporter to spell the other reporter. Could he be sworn? The reporter, Harold B. Alderson, was thereupon duly sworn by the chairman, whereupon the reporter, Harold B. Alderson, was duly sworn. Let's see. Okay, so now Mr. Robb is going to be interviewing a court reporter named Harold B. Alderson. So let me just make a new slide for him real quick. That is Harold B. Alderson. And I will also adjust this. Okay. Okay. Now, after you received this material from Mr. Hoover on Monday morning, do I understand your testimony that you presented it to the commission? Is that right? That is my recollection. And each of them read the material, is that correct? During the course of succeeding hours, or a couple of days, each of them did read it. Didn't they read it right then? That was my recollection. That they did. They sat down and began passing it around and took it to their offices and so on. Pardon me? I think some of them stayed and some of them took it to their offices for further reading and so on. Who was present at that meeting? My recollection is that all of the members of the commission were there, and I have something of a recollection that Mr. Jones was there, Tom Jones. Was Mr. Wilson, the general manager, there? I don't recall. Was anybody else? I really don't recall, and I know the commissioners were there. I'm quite sure they were. After you had digested this material that Mr. Hoover had sent you, did you form any opinion as to whether or not the information contained in Mr. Hoover's material was true or false? Let's see. Yeah, I'm kind of confused who's talking here, actually. It just says QA. I'm not sure if this is still Lilienthal or if this is the reporter. Let me see if I can figure this out. Okay, I think it's still Lilienthal, actually. That is interesting. Okay. I guess they just swapped out reporters. They weren't actually questioning a reporter. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, this is actually hard to tell because it definitely looks like on the transcript. Here, let me. It definitely looks like a new typewriter is being used. Like the keystrokes look ever so slightly different. So that would suggest to me that there's definitely a new reporter that's talking here, or that's typing here. But I'm not sure if it's the reporter that's testifying right now. Actually, wait, I might be able to check at the start. Sometimes they list who's talking when. Okay. Yeah, hard to say. Okay, I think it's still Mr. Lilienthal. I think they just swapped out court reporters. So, yeah, okay. Okay, so let me undo all that. Okay. Okay, let's start again at the beginning of 1370. Okay, now after you received this material from Mr. Hoover on Monday morning, do I understand your testimony that you presented it to the commission, is that right? That is my recollection. And each of them read the material, is that correct? During the course of succeeding hours, or a couple of days, each of them did read it. Didn't they read it right then? That was my recollection. That they did? They sat down and began passing it around and took it to their offices and so on. Pardon me? I think some of them stayed and some of them took it to their offices for further reading and so on. Who was present at that meeting? My recollection is that all of the members of the commission were there, and I have nothing of a recollection that Mr. Jones was there, Tom Jones. Or I have something of a recollection that Mr. Jones was there, Tom Jones. Was Mr. Wilson, the general manager, there? I don't recall. Was anybody else? I really don't recall, and I know the commissioners were there. I'm quite sure they were there. After you had digested this material that Mr. Hoover had sent you, did you form any opinion as to whether or not the information contained in Mr. Hoover's material was true or false? Well, I don't know how to answer that. The information was like other information, and we had no way of determining whether it was true or false, and we did not see the people, and the informants were anonymous and so on, and so I don't know how to answer that question. Well, from that point on, did you proceed on the assumption it was true, or did you proceed on the assumption it was false? Well, I proceeded on the assumption we proceeded to try to evaluate it, some of it having a ring of veracity, and some of it, for example, as I recall, one of the reports, and I think it is in this report, the informant turned out to be a 9-year-old boy. If that is true in this case, it may not be. Then obviously you would say, quote, well, this probably is not anything to rely on, end quote. But in other cases, the report would say that the informant X is someone that the Bureau has great confidence in, and you would assume that was true. Was the 9-year-old boy referred to in the material Mr. Hoover sent you on March 8th? I had an impression, but this may have been some other file, and as I remember that as an illustration of how you have to evaluate these things. Well now, having this material before you, I assume that contained certain allegations against Dr. Oppenheimer, didn't it? It constituted derogatory information about Dr. Oppenheimer, that's right. And you say you proceeded to evaluate it. We did our best to evaluate it. What did you do to evaluate it? Well, in general, speaking for myself, I followed this kind of a rule, that assuming that part of this material that has the ring of veracity to it is to be true, and discarding that looks rather unimportant, or perhaps not true, does this derogatory information balanced against all of the other things one knows about the man indicate that he is a security risk, or he is a man who would endanger the security of the United States? That is on the whole case. When did you go through that process? As we were reading the file. You mean that morning? Well, in the process of considering it, yes. When did you reach your conclusion on it? I don't recall exactly. It was, I think, probably during the course of that week after we talked to Dr. Oppenheimer, it was, I think, probably during the course of that week after we talked to Dr. Conant and these other people that knew Dr. Oppenheimer well. There was a consensus that there was no occasion for us to cancel this clearance by anything that we had seen. I don't think that there was any question raised by anyone to the contrary, but in any case, that was the feeling that I had. Didn't you reach that conclusion the same afternoon? That isn't my recollection, because we did go to the President or Dr. Bush, and I went to the President the next day, but it could be that. In the process of reaching that conclusion, sir, did you go back to Mr. Hoover to ask him for further details about this matter? We didn't immediately know. We recognized the responsibility, and Mr. Hoover had transmitted the most recent information he had, and the responsibility for evaluating, and the conclusion was ours. And we did later think that it would be wise to go and see whether we were misinterpreting some of this, and that was the purpose of the visit later in March. But did you communicate with Mr. Hoover and say, quote, "Mr. Hoover, here is an item here that we wonder about. What is your evidence to back this up?" End quote. No, I don't think we did. You didn't do that in respect to any of these items, did you? I don't think that was the practice. Did you do it? No, I don't think we did. And I believe you have testified there were some items that you accepted as true and some you had doubt about. Yes. I can't remember which was which, but I have the recollection that some of these things were stronger and more clear than others, but the whole picture was that of derogatory information about the man's past associations, and one episode that was worse than that. Which was that? Involving Chevalier. What do you mean worse than that, Mr. Lilienthal? Well, this struck me as being the only thing, the thing in the whole record that would give the gravest concern, and for that, and the thing that dismissed that concern from my mind, was the fact that General Groves and Mr. Landale, the security officer, at the time this happened, examined this man on the question and were apparently satisfied that this was not or did not endanger the national security, and the evidence to that was they kept him on. I can't add anything to that. That seemed to me a very conclusive kind of judgment about whether he was dangerous or not. Now, on that same day, this is March 10th again, in the afternoon, you met and talked to Dr. Bush, didn't you? About what? Dr. Bush? What is that? Didn't you meet and talk to Dr. Bush about Dr. Oppenheimer? Yes, and Dr. Bush was invited to meet with the commission, and I don't know whether it was that day or next, but it was about that time. And you wanted to get his opinion? Yes, sir. Did you show him this material from Mr. Hoover? I can't recall. Then I believe you called in Dr. Conant, didn't you? That is my recollection, yes, sir. Did you show the material to him? I don't recall. I certainly discussed the context of it, but I doubt whether he asked to read the file. You mean you made Dr. Conant familiar with the material? We tried to communicate to him what the nature of the derogatory information was, and I am now, my recollection is not precise about it, but that is my best recollection. We certainly conveyed to him the problem this report or file represented. Isn't it true, Mr. Lilienthal, that very day, March 10th, 1947, after talking with Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant, that you concluded that there was no doubt as to Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty? I don't recall whether it was that day. I am satisfied as to what the ultimate conclusion was, but we did not entertain any doubts for any length of time, and I, for one, entertained no doubt. Speaking for myself, entertained no doubts at all. Now, thereafter, I believe you testified you talked to Mr. Clifford at the White House about it. Yes. And what was the purpose of your conference with him? Well, we had in mind that Dr. Oppenheimer was an appointee of the President, and unlike employees of the Commission, he was an appointee of the President as a member of the General Advisory Committee, and we ought to make sure the President knew of the existence of this derogatory information. And so, as I recall, Dr. Bush and I conveyed this information to him, and I believe it was on the following day. By the way, Dr. Oppenheimer was appointed by the President in February, wasn't he? I don't recall. I thought it was earlier than that. At all events, it was prior to the time you received this information from Mr. Hoover, wasn't it? That is my recollection. Did you suggest to Mr. Clifford that a special board be convened to review this material? No, we did not. Was that ever discussed with Mr. Clifford? No, I believe not. Are you sure about that? I am not sure, but I have no recollection of it. Was there any reason that you knew of for the appointment of a board of any kind to review this material? No, it didn't seem to me, and I don't recall it seemed to anyone, that there was that much question about it. The reason for that, of course, is that this man, subsequent to the time of these events and these associations, had done a great deal for his country, and to prove by his conduct that he was a loyal citizen. of the country. He wasn't just an ordinary unknown individual whose achievements were not well known to us and to the people we consulted. As to the creation of a board of any sort to evaluate this material, it was never discussed between you and Mr. Clifford. I don't recall. It could be, but I don't recall that. Mr. Clifford, my impression is, Mr. Clifford said he would advise the president, but Mr. Clifford did not seem to take this seriously, and to the extent of requiring procedure of that kind, but I could be quite wrong about that. Now, you were asked by, I forget which one of counsel was pitching it at that time, was it Mr. Silverman? I guess, but you were asked what the Joint Committee knew about this material, and you said, as I recall, you didn't know whether they did or not. Is that right? I said that at a later date. I'm sure they did. Well, did you advise the Joint Committee of this development? I don't recall, and I just don't have any recollection of that. Isn't it a fact that you did not? Well, it may be. I just don't recall. Was there any reason why you shouldn't have? Any reason why we should or should not have? Should not have. Well, if we had doubts about our responsibility in the matter, I'm sure we would have done so, but we didn't. Did you discuss the question of whether or not you should advise the Joint Committee? I don't recall, and we couldn't have submitted a file to them in any case because at that time the President's regulations forbade it, and later on when the President's regulations were amended, this file was available to them. Now, I believe you were asked whether or not the FBI statement that you received from Mr. Hoover contained all of the information about Dr. Oppenheimer. Is that correct? I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. I will strike that question. It isn't very clear. I believe you were asked whether or not on March 8th or 10th, whichever it was, you had the complete story or file from Mr. Hoover, and you said you did. Is that right? Is that a question or an answer? Did you receive any further information from Mr. Hoover after you received the first information on March 8th or 10th? My recollection is that we didn't, but I wouldn't be positive about it. My recollection is that this was the whole of the information, whatever it was, the file or report. It was delivered, and it is my recollection that that was the sum total of what was delivered to us. Okay, I'm just gonna make sure the stream's back online. Sorry about that. I think my Wi-Fi just went out for a little bit, or the school Wi-Fi, I guess. Okay, I think we should be good. Okay, cool. Yeah, Rocket Knight says we're good. So I will continue. Okay. I don't recall. It sounds reasonable one should, but at a later state, we certainly discussed it with Mr. Volpe, because Mr. Volpe accompanied me on the visit to Mr. Hoover. Who was Mr. Volpe? At that time, he was Deputy General Counsel. Who was the General Counsel? He was Mr. Herbert Marks. Who is here? Yes, sir. Did you go over it with Mr. Marks? Well, I don't recall. I'm sure we went over it with Mr. Jones. He was present as the security officer, and whether we went over it with counsel, except this occasion of this visit to Mr. Hoover, I just don't remember. I think that I might say at this point the Senate Committee on Atomic Energy was holding hearings on the confirmation of the commission, and we were spending for 13 straight weeks most of my time up there, so that my recollection of the operations of the commission are not as clear as they might be. Let me ask a question on this point, Mr. Robb. Mr. Lilienthal, this was important enough to go and talk with Clark Clifford at the White House about, and was important enough for you to go back and talk with Mr. Hoover about it. And are you sure you didn't discuss it with the Deputy Counsel of the Commission? I would think that I assumed I did. Wouldn't it be unreasonable to think that you had not discussed it with the council if you went to the White House and so the Department of Justice with it? I'm not asking you to recall something you can't recall. Well, I am, sorry, if you can't recall. It depends, Mr. Chairman, on the functions of the General Counsel's office at that time in relation to security matters. If they had functions in that field, do you recall whether they did or not? My recollection is that those functions were confined to legal questions rather than questions of evaluating the file. The Security Office had the responsibility for assisting the Commission in a staff sense on evaluation of files. I think that was the practice from then continuously, actually. Now, the Atomic Energy Act required an FBI investigation of all personnel, does it not? Yes, sir. Did you have the FBI investigation which had been made pursuant to the Act at the time you made this decision in March? I can only tell you what my impression is. The Atomic Energy Act required a re-examination by the FBI and the bringing up to date of those people who had had clearance under the Manhattan District. Dr. Oppenheimer, of course, did have such, and I have been assuming what I have been saying here in my recollection is that this was that re-examination, his clearance up to this point having been a Manhattan District clearance, and I could be wrong about that. I believe you testified in response to a question by Mr. Silverman that you had read the letter of General Nichols to Dr. Oppenheimer, to General Groves. This is the difficulty of switching witnesses back and forth, and you get confused. The witness has only been here during his testimony. I understand, but I have been here through them all, and I am getting confused. You are not confused. General Nichols is the one. Have you read the letter from Mr. Nichols to Dr. Oppenheimer? Yes, I have. Do you recall in there the statement that Dr. Oppenheimer had contributed $150 a month to the Communist Party up to about April of 1942? No, I don't recall that. Well, do you recall whether or not you had any such allegation as that before you in March of 1947? Oh no, I couldn't remember as fine a point as that. No, I don't recall it. Do you recall whether or not in March of 1947 you had at the AEC the old Manhattan District files? I know that we were supposed to have them because the President's order, I believe, directed their transfer, and the President's order of December 31st, 1946. It transferred the properties and so on of the Manhattan District to the AEC, and that was presumably included the files of the Manhattan District. Just so we can be clear about that, I have before me a memorandum dated March 12, 1947, memorandum to the file signed by Bernard W. Menke, Staff Security Officer. Do you remember him? I don't. It refers to the FBI files, and I think under the rules I am not permitted to read it, but I will read the part pertinent to this particular point. Quote, the complete Manhattan Engineering District files concerning J.R. Oppenheimer were sent to the FBI about July or August of 1946, at the time he left employment controlled by the Manhattan Engineering District. This action was apparently in accordance with some agreement, the parties to which are said to have been General Groves, J.E. Hoover, and the Attorney General, under which agreement the FBI, upon assuming exclusive investigative jurisdiction of a person who departed from project work, received the full Manhattan Engineering District investigative file pertaining to that person. For this reason, the pertinent files are not available for reference in analyzing the instant summaries, end quote. From that, you conclude, wouldn't you, that the old Manhattan Engineering District files were not in your shop, so to speak? No. Apparently, they had been transferred to the FBI. Do you think you ever saw the Manhattan District files, Mr. Lilienthal? I'm beginning to doubt it, and if I had looked at this file before I came to testify, I would be a little clearer. I don't think that there is anything here that indicates whether you did or not see the Manhattan District file. I don't want to trap the witness. I am sure he didn't, because they were not there. I believe in your testimony in response to questions from Mr. Silverman this morning, you did refer to the Manhattan District files. Is it possible that you could have seen them at some other time or some other channel? I don't think so. I was referring to this report as counsel denominated it, as containing a summary, as he points out, of what all the Manhattan District files contain. Now, was Mr. Carroll Wilson present at the meetings which were held concerning this matter? I don't recall. My recollection is that these were executive meetings and those Mr. Wilson would not attend, but he might have attended. I don't really recall. I have before me, taken from the files, the original of the memorandum from Carroll L. Wilson, General Manager, to the file, and I will read it to you. Quote, United States Atomic Energy Commission, Washington, D.C. Shouldn't the reporter note the withdrawal of Dr. Evans? He is back here, so it is academic. Quote, United States Atomic Energy Commission, Washington, 25, D.C., Memorandum to the file, Carroll L. Wilson, General Manager, Subject J. Robert Oppenheimer, end quote. There is a longhand note, March 10th, 1947, copy 1 and 2, Series B, typed Security Office, D. Dean. Quote, March 10th, 1947. Summaries of information received on March 8th from the FBI regarding J. Robert Oppenheimer and his brother Frank F. Oppenheimer were considered by the commissioners in closed session this morning. This file was accompanied by a letter dated March 8th from Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, and the file was delivered to Mr. Jones by the FBI on Saturday morning, March 8th. The letter from Mr. Hoover transmitted a copy of what was described as a summary of the FBI files concerning J. Robert Oppenheimer and his brother Frank F. Oppenheimer. The summary consisted of material usually referred to as derogatory. The commission met in closed session, and each of the commissioners read the rather voluminous summary and noted from the incompleteness of the account as contained in the summary that either it did not reflect the results of a full investigation or did not contain all information bearing on the matter. The commission also noted that the evidence summarized, which, as stated in Mr. Hoover's letter, came from confidential sources, could seriously impeach Dr. Oppenheimer, and that as a consequence, this matter was one in which not only the Commission, but also Dr. Bush as chairman of the Joint Research and Development Board and Dr. Conant as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission of the JRDB were also concerned. Furthermore, in view of the role of both Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant in connection with the Manhattan Project during the war and their association with Dr. Oppenheimer while he was director of the Los Alamos Laboratory of the Manhattan Project, it was felt that they should be consulted promptly. Dr. Bush was reached by telephone, and it was arranged that he meet the commission at 3:15 p.m. At 3:15 p.m., the commissioners met and were joined by Dr. Bush. The delivery of this file and the fact that it contained derogatory information were reported to Dr. Bush, although he was not shown the file. Dr. Bush stated that he was not familiar with Dr. Oppenheimer's background prior to his joining the Manhattan Project in 1942, but that he had concurred in the choice of Dr. Oppenheimer by General Groves for the important post of the Los Alamos Bomb Laboratory, and that he felt that Dr. Oppenheimer's exceptional performance as director of that laboratory and subsequently in other roles advising the government on the subject of atomic energy had clearly demonstrated his loyalty as a citizen of the United States and his integrity. Inasmuch as Dr. Conant had been closely associated with Dr. Oppenheimer in connection with the Manhattan Project, he was invited to sit with the commission and Dr. Bush for discussion of this matter, and he joined the meeting at about 3:45. Dr. Conant stated that his association with Dr. Oppenheimer dated from the beginning of Dr. Oppenheimer's connection with the Manhattan Project, and that he was not familiar with the contents of any investigative files concerning Dr. Oppenheimer's background. He stated that General Groves had taken full responsibility for selection of Dr. Oppenheimer to head the Los Alamos laboratory, and that it was certainly a matter of public knowledge that this laboratory, under Dr. Oppenheimer's brilliant and driving leadership, had made an enormous contribution to the war effort. Inasmuch as General Groves had made the original selection of Dr. Oppenheimer, the chairman attempted to reach him by telephone, but was advised that he was en route by automobile from Florida to Washington and could not be reached. Drs. Bush and Conant shared the views of the Commission that the record of Dr. Oppenheimer's contributions to the country in this field during the last 4 or 5 years have been so outstanding that it could leave no doubt as to his loyalty. It was further stated that in view of Dr. Oppenheimer's unique position as an authority in this field, if anything were permitted to occur which might cause him to be lost to the government in connection with atomic energy, it would be a very serious blow to our progress in this field, and would have very serious consequences in the attitude of his fellow scientists toward this project. Even if no precipitous action were taken which would affect Dr. Oppenheimer's continuous in his present efforts with respect to this project, any public disclosure, either of the information contained in files or of the fact that such information exists, which is the subject of serious concern as to Dr. Oppenheimer's qualifications, the consequences upon the leading scientists engaged in the project would still be serious. In view of the interest of the War Department and the role of the War Department in bringing Dr. Oppenheimer originally into this project, Drs. Conant and Bush arranged to see Secretary Patterson later in the afternoon. They did see him, and he promptly agreed to contact General Groves. March 11th, 1947, the Commission met this morning and for further consideration of the matters discussed yesterday in connection with Dr. Oppenheimer. The Commission concluded tentatively, 1, that on the basis of the... What is that? Okay, I think we're back. Sorry about that. That is my fault. We have some chat. Yeah, just again, I'm on my school Wi-Fi network because I'm in my school library, and the Wi-Fi seems to be spotty right now for whatever reason. But let's see. So I will just quickly read some comments from CDP, who says, at Graviton Media, sorry tuned in late today. Keep going, man. Thank you. I'm glad that you like these episodes. And of course, you can always watch them back afterward if you tune in late. And CDP also says, is the transmission broken now, or is it me? Yeah, no, that's on my end. I'm going to keep going, but if the Wi-Fi goes out again, I might just wrap for the day and come back next time because there's not much I can do about this because it's the school Wi-Fi network. I have no control over whether they fix it or not, so, yeah. Okay, anyway, continuing. So, Mr. Robb is reading this letter. Okay. The Commission concluded tentatively, 1, that on the basis of the information supplied by Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant concerning Dr. Oppenheimer's outstanding contributions in this project and his consistent concern for the security of this country in connection with his services as a member of the JRDP Committee on Atomic Energy and as an advisor to the Department of State, Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty was prima facie clear despite material contained in the FBI file. 2, that as a result of his work for the government during the last 4 years, he is now one of the best, if not the best, informed scientist in regard to restricted data concerning atomic energy. 3, that while under these circumstances the questions raised by the summary did not create an issue or any immediate hazard, it was essential to undertake promptly a full and reliable evaluation of the case, that it could be promptly disposed of in one way or another. As a first step, it was decided to secure as promptly as possible written expression of views from Dr. Bush, Dr. Conant, and General Groves as to Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty. As a second step, it was decided that the chairman should confer with Dr. Bush and Mr. Clifford of the White House concerning the establishment of an evaluation board of distinguished jurists to make a thorough review and evaluation of the case. Inasmuch as Dr. Oppenheimer is a presidential appointee to the General Advisory Committee to the Commission, the case is one in which the White House has a definite interest. In addition, the matter is of interest to the Department of State inasmuch as Dr. Oppenheimer has served as an advisor to the Department of State on many phases of atomic energy, including serving as a member of the Board of Consultants to the Department of State in the preparation of a plan for the international control of atomic energy, and subsequently as an advisor to Mr. Baruch and more recently as advisor to Mr. Frederick Osborne. At 3 p.m. today, Dr. Bush and the chairman, end quote, that was you, wasn't it? Yes, sir. Dr. Bush and the chairman met with Clifford and advised him of the circumstances in connection with this case and discussed with him the desirability of having a review of this case by a board of distinguished jurists or other citizens. The chairman proposed that there be considered for membership on this board judges of the Supreme Court. Mr. Clifford stated that he was decidedly opposed to any move which would draw members of the court into outside activities and felt that this case did not warrant an exception to that policy. This policy would not preclude selection of other jurists for temporary service on such an evaluation board if it were deemed desirable that such a board be established. Mr. Clifford stated that he would discuss the matter with the President and communicate with the Chairman and Dr. Bush on Wednesday. The results of the discussion with Mr. Clifford were reported to the Commission at a meeting at 5 p.m. this afternoon. At that meeting, the General Manager reported that a detailed analysis of the FBI summary was in process of preparation by the Commission's security staff as an aid to evaluation, end quote. Have you any comment on that, Mr. Lilienthal? No, I haven't. It is quite evident that Mr. Clifford, in the end, did not favor the idea of such a board, or perhaps we changed our minds. But I had forgotten that recommendation. You had forgotten that? Yes, I think the thing that this does confirm is that the initial reaction of the commissioners was as stated on the whole case. In view of the record of service to his country, this did not raise questions in our minds, but was a case or matter that should be very carefully dealt with, and dealt with very carefully in the evaluation process. But you would agree, would you not, sir, that in 1947 you and the Commission seriously considered and in fact were of the view that a board should be impaneled to consider this matter? It is quite evident from this memorandum that this was considered, and you thought enough of it to go to Mr. Clifford at the White House and so recommend. That is right. In other words, you recommended in 1947 that the exact step which is now being taken be taken. We suggested it, and I think perhaps that is the import of the memorandum, as I recall. We suggested this to the White House. That step did not strike you as fantastic or unreasonable, did it? No. Now, did you talk with Mr. Clifford again about that matter of the board? I don't recall, and I really don't. I will show you the original of a memorandum on March 12, 1947, 11:25 a.m., report of telephone conversation at 11:20 with Clark M. Clifford, special counsel for the President. That is dated March 12th, and it has Dell on the bottom. Did you write that, Mr. Lilienthal? Whereupon the document was handed to the witness. Did you say, quote, did he write it? Did he dictate it? This is a record that he purportedly made. Your answer is that you did dictate it. Yes, it would appear that I did, and may I read it? I am about to read it to you. All right. I will be asking Mr. Rolander to read it. Quote, March 12, 1947, 11:25 a.m. Report of telephone conversation at 11:20 with Clark M. Clifford, Special Counsel to the President. I put in the call to Clifford. I told him that following the conference yesterday afternoon with him, Dr. Bush and myself concerning an FBI report on a member of the General Advisory Committee, it was Dr. Bush's and my understanding that the status of the matter was as follows. Quote, that having presented the matter to the President by the method of presenting it to Mr. Clifford would lay the matter before the President and advise us whether we should proceed to submit this matter to a board of review of judges or other outstanding citizens outside the government, or what course should be followed. I said that until we heard from him, it was Dr. Bush's and my understanding that the record would be supplemented by statements from Dr. Bush, Dr. Conant, etc., and an analysis of the report made within the Commission, but that no steps would be taken with respect to a board of review in this case. He said that Dr. Bush's and my understanding in this respect was correct. He said that after our conference, he had briefly discussed the matter with the President, that it was a matter the President would want to think over, that it was presented at a time when the President, here I'm relying on my shorthand notes taken during the conversation, was exceedingly busy on an all-important matter, namely the crisis in the Mediterranean. Clifford said he, the President, will want to think it over some, that the next few days the President will be away from Washington. He will have time to think it over and determine if the Board of Review idea is the proper way to go about it. I told Mr. Clifford that we had not reported the receipt of this report on a presidential nominee to the Joint Committee or to its chairman. I asked if he had any comment on that. Quote, you have put it up to the President through me and are awaiting his reaction after he has had time to give it some thought. You have done the two things that are right to do. One, the Commission has made an immediate check with the three individuals who know most about the situation, Dr. Bush, Dr. Conant, and General Groves. And two, you have presented the matter over here. So far as I know, that is all that you are under any reasonable obligation to do, end quote. He said that we should therefore let the matter stand until we hear from him. He said that if I had not heard from him by the time the President returns to Washington, I should call and remind him about it. He said that if absolutely essential, he could interrupt the President and get some decision about the Board of Review at any time, but that he didn't want to do so unless it was absolutely urgent. I said that the man in question had been awarded a Medal of Merit, the highest civilian award for his war work. It was my impression that these awards were made by the President on the basis of recommendations by a distinguished reviewing board. He said that the board initiated the recommendations and reviewed them, and then the President acted upon them. He said further that he would supply a copy of this recommendation, which could be made part of the record in this matter. Now, Mr. Lilienthal, this was a matter of grave import to you, wasn't it? Let's see. There's a page missing. That sucks. Okay. Okay, so there's a page missing. Yeah. And to make what is a lapse of memory seem like a deliberate falsification. I regret this kind of procedure, which is quite suitable in criminal... Oh, wait, that's probably here. And to make what is a lapse of memory seem like a deliberate falsification. I regret that this kind of procedure, which is quite suitable in criminal prosecutions and a court of law, when that attempt is being made before a jury, I'm sorry that it has to be made here. Mr. Chairman, may I reply to that, as I take it to be some reflection upon my professional integrity and my professional methods. Let me say, I have not questioned your integrity. I have no apology to make for the methods I am pursuing in the cross-examination of these witnesses. It is an aniom at the greatest invention known to man for the discovery of truth is cross-examination, and I am pursuing what Mr. Garrison should know are orthodox, entirely proper, and entirely legitimate methods of cross-examination. I make no apology to Mr. Garrison or anyone else for the method I am pursuing, and I submit that I have been entirely fair. I asked the witness, and I have taken him over these matters which I submit are matters which, well, I won't make an argument on that point, and he has said he did not remember them, and now I have read him these papers, and he says that he forgot them. Mr. Chairman, may I make this comment, that in the great multiplicity of things that went on at that time, it is not at all impossible that I should not remember even as important a matter as this. But a simple way to secure the truth and accuracy would have been to have given me these files yesterday, when I asked for them, so that when I came here I could be the best possible witness and disclose as accurately as possible what went on at that time. I'm a little confused about the technique. The board wants the facts, and the facts are in the file, and I asked for the files so I could be a better witness, and it was denied me. So I just have to rely on memory during a very troubled and difficult time on matters that are obviously important. But they are not as important as many other things we were concerned with at that time. It would help me a good deal, and I could be a much better witness if I saw the files that I helped contribute to make. Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Garrison would agree that it is entirely fair comment to make that it is demonstrated that the memory of the witness was not infallible. I would be the first to insist on that. Since we are depending largely on memory, I think it is a fair test. Why when we have documents? I thought the notion of an inquiry and not trial was to get at the truth by the shortest possible route, and it seems to me the attempt to make a witness seem to be not telling the truth, or his memory is not to be relied on by this board, by the surprise production of documents, is not the shortest way to arrive at the truth. It seems to me more like a criminal trial than it does like an inquiry, and I just regret it has to be done here. Well, the board certainly will take cognizance of the comments of counsel in respect to this matter, and I think that if counsel is not permitted to engage in cross-examination and simply relies on notes the witnesses may take from documents in a file, there may be some difficulty in arriving at some evaluations. And now, on this particular point, it seems to me pertinent, at least against general and public discussions with which counsel cannot be unaware, including the New York Times story, the information for which was furnished by counsel. It is repeatedly and publicly stated that the Commission and others cleared Dr. Oppenheimer at the time that these were old charges rehashed, and completely considered and evaluated at that time. It does seem important to me, at least as chairman of this board, to find out exactly what did take place at that time. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, in full. I want knowing but the truth brought out here. I want nothing but the truth brought out here, and all of the truth about all of the things, and I want complete cross-examination, and I raise only the question of surprising the witnesses with documents they themselves prepared, which are in the file and which the government has, and it seems to me a shorter way of arriving at the truth and a fairer way, where a witness has prepared a document which the government has in its possession, is to ask him if he prepared that document and to read it into the record rather than confuse him first by asking him about things that he doesn't remember. That is the only point I make, and that limited point, and I wish in no way to confine this inquiry, but it is an important point, though limited. May I proceed? I have two more questions. You are not going to confront the witness with any more documents. Was any board ever convened? No, I'm sure of that. Did you hear any more from Mr. Clifford about it? I don't recall. We certainly didn't have a recommendation from him that a board be convened, or such a board would have been convened. Now, you testified, I believe, that I think in 1949 you were working on an A-bomb of vastly increased power. Is that right? Yes, sir. About 500,000 tons of TNT, is that right? My recollection, which I think is correct, is that this was in the order of 20 to 25 times the Hiroshima, which would work out to 400,000 or 500,000. One of those bombs, you used the words working on, and what I think I said was a program approved and being accelerated to that end, and I had assumed that the fission bomb referred to by the President on December 8th was presumably that bomb. And one of those bombs would take out a small city, and two would take out a big one. Is that right? My recollection of the estimates that were made at that time to us by the technical people, Dr. Bradbury and so on, was that one such bomb would take out all targets in the United States except perhaps a 2 to 5, most of the large cities of the United States, and 2 would take out any large city. Was there any reluctance or any hanging back on the part of scientists to work on that bomb because of what we call moral grounds? No. That is all. I wanted to ask a question about this document. Which one, sir? The document that I wrote, not that one, but the one that was referred to or read into the record in the closed session. In that regard, there is the disposition. I suggested, and I don't know whether this is in the record or not, but I would like to get it clear, that I suggested that it would be easier for me and more convenient for me if this stayed in the Commission's files, and so I won't have the responsibility of its protection, which is a fairly complicated business. Although I have very great question in view of what Mr. Beckerly said about the confidential nature of it, I don't want to take any chances on it. I haven't shown this to anyone, but I have relied on its contents, and an article appeared in the October 4th issue of the New York Times, and I want to be sure that this is not a surprise to the board. In the course of that article, I did not quote from this. I recited the kind of arguments that were made at the time, but I did not disclose any of the confidential information, I'm confident. But I would prefer to have the document here, and I would like to renew my request, the request I made to Mr. Snapp, that an effort be made to separate out these things which are clearly not confidential at all, and simple expressions of my views, and those things which they regard as possibly confidential because they had not consulted the State Department or the Department of Defense. Then I would just like to leave this here and not have the responsibility of it. I have no objection to your recital. Actually, I would suggest that this is a matter between you and the Atomic Energy Commission, or at least the security people in the government, and not with the board as to what disposition is made of the original document. So I think whatever requests you make, don't rely on this board to see that they are carried out with respect to the treatment of the document. I should also say, Mr. Lilienthal, that I, for one, did not know of the existence of this document until we started our discussion of it, whenever it was today. May I say the same for counsel on this side? I didn't either. The first I heard of the document was this morning. There is one point, and the reason I mention it is because I did not want any question about the fact that I have relied upon the substance of the statement of my view in this piece and relied upon the expression of those views as reflected in this document. For an effort to state clearly in a public article in the New York Times what my position was at that time, and the reason being that that position was, I thought, being unfairly presented. And I just want to be clear, as far as the board is concerned, that that is no failure to disclose that at that time I turned this back. I'm sorry to have to address another couple of questions to you. I apologize to everybody, including my colleagues on the board and council. I'm still confused about the instructions to the General Advisory Committee for the October 29, 1949 meeting. This, I think, is pertinent to the inquiry because Dr. Oppenheimer, in his reply, says that the Atomic Energy Commission called a special session of GAC and asked to consider and advise on two related questions. First, it was whether, in view of the Soviet success, the Commission's progress was adequate. Now, that is covered, I believe, in the letter which was read into the record, which you wrote the General Advisory Committee. Am I correct in that? I think so. I'm not trying to trap you. I must say I am getting a little, that is my recollection of it, it was a short letter. And if not, in which way it should be altered or increased, and I think that that was correct. And second, and now I am reading from Dr. Oppenheimer's reply, whether a crash program for the development of the super should be a part of any new program. Now, in your letter, which was read into the record, and in my recollection of the letter signed by Mr. Pike, As acting chairman, I haven't yet found any reference to this specific question as to whether a crash program in relation to the super was put to the commission. Now, it is entirely possible. Was put to the GAC? Was put to the GAC. And it may be fruitless to pursue this at this point, and I would like somehow to be informed as to how that second question actually was put to the GAC. It is Dr. Oppenheimer's recollection, clearly, that they were asked, or I believe he so testified, and he put it in his letter. And I'm not suggesting that they were not asked, but I am trying to find out how they were asked. If you do not have any recollection, I do not want to pursue it further with you now. I'm sure it was presented to the GAC, but I must say I cannot exactly say... I'm sure it was presented to the GAC, but I must say I cannot say exactly in what form. In security problems, generally, Mr. Lilienthal, was Mr. Volpe a person whom you frequently consulted? He accompanied you, I believe, to Mr. Hoover's office in connection with this matter. Did you frequently consult him generally, and was he your security sort of person? He was consulted because legal questions frequently arose, and he probably, and I can't recall precisely, he may well have been consulted on the general questions of policy. This is just too vague in my recollection to know just how that division of responsibility was made. I have one further question. I think perhaps if it is important, I could dig into the files and try to illuminate that, but I haven't any recollection. I have one further question, which relates to your feeling in early 1950 that it would be unwise to proceed with a program which would lead to a test of the super. Is that stated correctly? Yes, I stated it more extensively than that, but I thought something ought to be done beforehand. I'm about to come to that. Until there had been a rigorous re-examination of military plans and policies, were these things in your judgment mutually exclusive? In other words, could not the re-examination have gone forward simultaneously with steps which might determine the feasibility of the super? In this memorandum and in my statement to the National Security Council, I tried to indicate why I felt that they could not. That going ahead with this program would prejudice that re-examination, and I could well have been wrong about it, but that was the view I had, and that is what I said. In fact, no re-examination was made, but in any case, my concern that once that decision were made, the re-examination wouldn't take place. Whether I was right or not, it was the view I had. I didn't understand that. Did it occur to you that, as it did to some people who were active and informed in this program, proceeding with further development might prove that the super was infeasible, or was not feasible? Or did you assume that if we really went ahead with it, we could do something about it? Well, I was as much concerned as anything with the effect of an announcement that we were going into an all-out program of that kind, that would prejudice the re-examination, and whether it came out that we could make it or couldn't, that would confirm the course we then pursued, or reliance not upon really taxing ourselves and really going to town with an important military program, but going off on this same course again. That suggests that if you had to make a guess as to the feasibility, you would have guessed it was feasible. I think that I can't improve on the way in which we presented our conclusion on this to the President, that we were assuming that it could be done. That answers my question. I have no questions except for one I would like to ask Mr. Robb. Do we now have all of the documents on this clearance thing in 1947, or are there later documents? There is one thing in the file, and do you want me to read it now if I can find it? We might just as well have it complete. Is this something that needs to be read at this time? I can read it the first thing in the morning. Is it something that must be read in Mr. Lilienthal's presence? It may be. It is dated July 18th, and I don't know whether it had to do with this or not. I will read it if you want me to right now. Quote, Confidential Office Memorandum, United States Government, to Lyle Billsley, from T.L. Jones. Subject J. Robert Oppenheimer, July 18th, 1947. Herewith a complete investigative file on J. Robert Oppenheimer, upon whom it is believed the Commission may not have formalized their decision. If the Commission meeting minutes contain indication of Commission action, would you kindly so advise? If they do not, I presume that you will wish to docket this case for early consideration. Each commissioner and the general manager have seen every report in this file, with the exception of a summary of July 17th and my memorandum for the file dated July 14th, 1947. End quote. In longhand, there is, quote, Joe Volpe, time flies. Will you please go to work on this? End quote. Signed, GLB. Then also in longhand, quote, August 2nd, return to Mr. Billsley by hand, end quote. Underscored twice, Lyle. Underscored twice, quote, Lyle, I looked over this file after you left it with me last night. My impression is that the Commission saw no need for formal action following the meeting they had with Mr. Hoover, referred to in Lilienthal's letter of April 3rd to the FBI director. I assume that the information which has come in since that time has been circulated among the over-commissioners for their information. If Tom thinks the summary of July 17th and his file memorandum of July 14th should be circulated, that should be done. In addition, I think that you should check my impression of the status of this case with the Commission itself, J.V. Jr., end quote. And the next thing is on August 11th, which I believe we had, but just so that it will be complete, I will read it. Quote, Office Memorandum, date August 11th, 1947, from T.L. Jones, initials T.L.J., to William Unna. Subject J. Robert Oppenheimer. Authorization for granting final Q-type security clearance to the subject is contained in minutes of the meeting of the Atomic Energy Commission at 10:30 a.m., Wednesday, August 6th, 1947. It is reflected in the minutes that this clearance was granted during February 1947, but was reaffirmed because previous minutes failed to reflect the action. In addition, as you know, Dr. Oppenheimer was previously cleared by the Manhattan District. Would you please make the appropriate entry in your records? End quote. Now, is that all there is? What about the memorandum of July 14th? That is the summary of an FBI file, which I don't think I can read. That is July 17th. And July 14th also. July 14th, quote, to file, from T.L. Jones, signed T.L.J. Date, July 14th, 1947. Subject, J. Robert Oppenheimer and Philip Morrison. July 10th, 1947, in the course of a conversation with John Lansdale, Jr., former Chief of Intelligence and Security for Major General Ralph E. Groves, you mentioned the two subject cases with both of which he had contact during the war. In both cases, in fact, Lansdale himself interviewed the men at some length. I did not ask Mr. Lansdale for an official opinion on either case, and no doubt before giving one, should this ever be considered desirable, he would wish an opportunity to review the cases and apprise himself of recent developments. However, his rather casual comments seemed of interest and worth preserving in the files. These were that he was absolutely certain of the present loyalty of J. Robert Oppenheimer, despite the fact that he doubtless was at one time at least an avid fellow traveler, but that he felt that Morrison was a communist. Lansdale has not, of course, had occasion to review the recent reports on either man, as his remarks should probably be interpreted as reflecting his judgment at the time of his most recent review of each case. End quote. That is all. I want to apologize to the Commission for piling my straw on top of it. We will recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Lilienthal. Thank you for your consideration in seeing me through today. We will adjourn. Thereupon at 7:45 p.m., a recess was taken until Wednesday, April 21st, 1954 at 9:30 a.m. So yeah, that was a very long day of trial, or of hearings. I believe the longest day here. So obviously everyone was kind of getting sick of it by the end. But But yeah, that was some interesting stuff that they talked about. You can see the people getting increasingly frustrated with the case. Oppenheimer's counsel is getting very frustrated with Roger Robb's tactics. And I'll remind you that in the picture of Roger Robb that I have here on the left, it's a portrait for his circuit court justice position. So when he got appointed to be in the D.C. Circuit, I believe it was. And the D.C. Circuit is the second most prestigious court in the United States after the Supreme Court. So Roger Robb is a very serious lawyer, a very serious force to be reckoned with. So it's quite intense sitting across from him. And so obviously counsel is frustrated because the board keeps saying, oh, you know, this isn't exactly like a trial. Like, we kind of structure it sort of like a trial so that because we think it's just a good way at arriving at the truth. But really, you know, the goal is to like arrive at the truth. But then Roger Robb keeps pulling out these like crack lawyer tactics that you would see in like a crazy, like high profile legal case. And so they're just like very frustrated with that. But then Robb's like, what? I'm not doing anything wrong. What's wrong? So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. I will say that I'm probably going to have to take a hiatus from this for a few weeks. Because next week I have a conflict over the weekend. I have a rocket launch. And then the week after that, I'm going to have my wisdom teeth removed. Yeah. So yeah, my wisdom teeth are coming in, and so I'm going to have them removed next Thursday. So I'm probably not going to be feeling all that well by next Sunday to do a live stream because, you know, my mouth's going to be all numb. So it's probably going to be not the best idea to try reading for a few hours. So can't do it then. And then I also doubt if I can do it the next weekend because I'm going to be catching a flight that Sunday. Oh, actually, I might be able to do it. Okay. Because I'm catching a flight on the Saturday. So, okay. So I might be back St. Patrick's Day. But if not, I'll be back. Yeah, okay, I'll be back St. Patrick's Day because the next weekend I also have a conflict. Anyway, whatever. If you want to know when the next live stream is, just, you know, follow me on social media, Graviton Media on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, whichever you're most interested in, and there will be updates on those websites about future live streams. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.